Construction makers.
In trading card games, there's this thing known as the 2-year curse, which basically means that after about 2 years, there's enough cards that have been printed into the game that the designers need to do something to kind of clear out some of the old design mistakes from the early sets to make room for the new cards. Historically, this has been done through something that's called set rotation, which basically means that on a schedule, older sets will rotate out as new sets are released. Players tend to really not like this idea, right? These game pieces that may have taken you quite a while to acquire, we're now saying you're not able to play with them anymore. This system, of course, was pioneered by Magic the Gathering, but it wasn't always a given that this would be the structure under which the game operates. The idea of set rotation came fairly early on in Magic, but it came from one critical decision. When it came time for Magic to release its sort of first standalone expansion, Arabian Nights, Richard Garfield, the creator of the game, advocated for Arabian Nights to have its own unique card back. And what this would mean was players could make the choice as to whether or not they wanted to play with that expansion, and you'd be able to see in their deck the cards that were from that expansion. I think by today's standards, it seems a little weird that you would have different card backs, but initially this was really Richard's design intent. There's a huge debate within the game designers at Wizards of the Coast at the time as to how to actually handle that first expansion. Ultimately, they decided to print the expansion with the same Magic the Gathering back that we know and love today. But that was a really critical decision in not only Magic, but in TCGs generally, because it set this precedent that new expansions would be made with the same card back. They're all made to be mixed together without any kind of indicator that they're from a different set of cards. But it also birthed the idea that, all right, well, if we're going to do that and we're not going to give players the tools to select the expansions that they wanted to play with, we need to create some kind of alternative system to rotate through the cards that they were going to make. It would be pretty difficult for you to sell players on a new set if it was meant to be mixed in with the old cards when the old cards were just so substantially more powerful. So once they were locked into the same card back, they needed to come up with a way to remove those older, more powerful cards from the format and make way for new ones. And this is where we got the idea of rotation. First, let's look at why do set rotation at all. It's a way to keep play options manageable. It's a way to let design mistakes fall out of the format. It's a way to prevent too many crazy combos. So like if the card pool is limited and smaller, it's less likely that you get really strange interactions between cards that tend to let players win the game pretty easily. It's a way to prevent power creep. We've talked about this before with the Escher's stairwell idea, where if you can put the power level in different sets in different areas, and if you can keep the card pool in a way that none of those sort of power outlier areas overlap, then you can fit the sets together like puzzle pieces so that nothing is too powerful. I think one of the most important things that doesn't get talked about enough with set rotation is it allows designers to experiment. It allows them to try crazy and interesting ideas, knowing that eventually if we miss and this thing is just crazy, eventually it'll rotate out of the format. And the obvious answer as to why rotating is important is that it's a way to sell cards. Okay, so we've defined why rotation matters. But before we get into reimagining what rotation could look like, let's talk about the things that killed Standard and Magic the Gathering. And that way we can see what a better solution might look like that could avoid the pitfalls that the Standard format ultimately fell victim to. The first one was something of circumstance. I don't think this was a contributing factor. I think this was more of a catalyst that I think kind of ended the format as we knew it. And that was COVID, right? Is that when the world shut down and there were no in-person events to go to, Magic players flocked online, which led them, I think, in two different directions. One was to get together with either smaller groups of your friends to play more casual Magic, or to play Magic online on webcams, and that format of choice was Commander. And then on the flip side of that, if you wanted to continue to play Standard, you were pushed towards Arena. Okay, so next let's look at like design choices that Wizards has made that affect the Standard format. And the first one to address is probably Universes Beyond, where I don't think Universes Beyond itself is contributing to Standard not doing well, but I do think that Universes Beyond creates some kind of weird incentives for Wizards where they are able to produce many more sets because they can sort of lean on these other intellectual properties where previously they would have had to build their own worlds, and that was taking up a lot of resources. But I think the sort of advantage to that was that it slowed their cadence down. Now the sort of chains are off and they can make 6 sets a year instead of being able to make 3 sets a year plus kind of a core set. Again, Universe Beyond itself, I don't really think affects this. I think it's the way that Universes Beyond has opened up and changed the incentives for Wizards. The other thing I'll touch on with Universes Beyond is that it does bring in players who are interested in the intellectual property and not necessarily the strategic gameplay of Magic the Gathering, where previously you would be enticing players to join the game because you were doing something like a new and interesting, innovative new mechanic. We're not going to talk really anymore about Universes Beyond, but generally speaking, I think that it's not Universes Beyond itself that is kind of the problem. It's kind of the incentives that Universes Beyond creates. Next, I think we need to talk about fire design a little bit, because fire design is fire design is looked at as the thing that made it so that Wizards was starting to make more broken cards in the format. They started pushing things more. There's a correlation between when fire design started and when a lot more bans started happening in the format and speeding up the format, generally speaking. But I think it's important that we understand that there were probably issues with Standard before fire design happened. Why would you take such a risk, why would you make such a big change if everything was going according to plan? It could be that they were seeing dwindling player numbers and needed to make a change. So I don't think fire design necessarily, or the idea of trying to see how much more powerful you could make Standard before it broke, I don't think that's necessarily the wrong idea, but it was a contributing factor to, I think, players, I think maybe it had sort of the opposite effect here. Instead of bringing new players into the format, I think it disenfranchised players that were still there. Okay, so let's talk about what I think might be the biggest contributing factor, and that's Arena, for 2 reasons. One is that most of the Standard that's played on Arena is played best of 1, and this is because of design pressures put on the game due to mobile gaming generally, and that players want to play a mobile game in a shorter burst. And if you're trying to play a best 2 out of 3 match of Magic while you're on the train or whatever else you're doing, you're not going to be able to finish a best 2 out of 3 match in the amount of time given. Magic was sort of pushed into a more best of 1 world. We're not going to get entirely into sort of the implications of not having a sideboard, but I will say it does put more pressure on reactive decks because they would have to play the sort of interaction spells. You sort of have to like call your shot perfectly for the meta instead of being able to have other tools in your sideboard against more aggressive strategies. So best of 1 tends to favor more aggressive strategies. And that leads to kind of odd gameplay dynamics, right? Where we get this fast accumulation of resources or fast damage to your opponent, things like red deck wins, that ultimately make the game feel a bit less interactive. The other thing that Arena provided was a whole lot of data. And we actually saw Wizards of the Coast try to take action on this not that long ago. They tried to stop publishing so many results from Magic Online, thinking that if they sort of limited the data that was available, they could make it so that the format was not being solved as quickly. Ultimately, I feel like that's kind of like, trying to put, like, you're like stopping one hole while the rest of the dam is still just like falling apart. So I don't think that stopping that data flow is really going to result in what you would want it to. Players might have to jump through more hoops to find that data, but they're still going to be able to find that data. We'll touch on 3-year rotation real quick. I mentioned it earlier, but really the problem is that the Escher stairwell technique doesn't really work as well. This could still work, I think, if they sliced the power a bit differently rather than having like a set be themed on like, well, this one has powerful creatures, and this one has powerful spells, and this one has powerful lands, and you're sort of moving through those different bigger buckets of power. You can slice the power through archetypes instead, where you're just it's just a more thin slice. This is where I think we're getting things like lessons and arcane and things like that, so they can slice the power more thinly. Another thing we look at is the modern format, and I think the popularity of the modern format was probably the first real step towards Standard failing. Ultimately, I think it was giving players what they were looking for. Enough buildup of Standard had happened that there were a lot of lapsed players that were looking for a way to play their cards that they still had. And the Modern format ended up stepping up to kind of fill that void. With it being a non-rotating format, I think it was kind of only a matter of time before Modern sort of ended up in the sort of problem territory that formats like Legacy also do, where they kind of get solved, and then Wizards of the Coast wants to print a set directly into Modern to try to shake up the metagame, and then we get the Modern Horizon sets. But whatever, that's like a different problem. But ultimately, when they were giving players what they wanted and giving them a destination to go to other than playing Standard, a lot of players, I think, chose to jump ship and instead play the Modern format. And so this one's kind of weird, right? Like, you're giving players what they want by giving them a format that doesn't rotate, but that ultimately gives them a place to go that removes the resistance from, it removes sort of the reason to stay in that rotating format that you kind of need the players to stay in. And I think the final nail in the coffin here was that Commander took over Magic as being the way that most of the players play the game. It's not really Commander's fault. I think we really need to look at Standard as kind of a failed experiment. It's starting to become kind of an archaic way to incentivize players to buy new cards. I think reflecting on the things that Standard did wrong, rather than sort of pointing the finger at Commander as the thing that ultimately killed it, well, if Standard was a better way that players wanted to play the game, Standard would still be the way that everybody's playing the game. So I think it's pretty important to think about the fact that, like, yeah, Standard always had player churn, right? Players were coming into the format, players were leaving the format. And once that math stopped mathing and the sort of hole in the bucket became too large, players just started dropping out faster than new players were joining the format. The writing was kind of on the wall. Let's take a look at other ways that we might be able to maintain sort of the benefits of the Standard format and remove the drawbacks for players, which the big one is that their cards ultimately aren't playable. So I think the criteria that I would be looking for in a new system would be that you have the ability to maintain power creep, like keep power creep down. You have the ability to experiment, and ideally players would have the ability to keep their game pieces. I'll touch on one way to do this that is already being done by a current game, and that's Yu-Gi-Oh! And one way to do it is through archetype design. I'll probably have a whole video about archetype design at some point, but right now, basically all you would need to know is that there are powerful effects that are tied specifically to other iconic cards. If we were to translate this into like Magic terminology, it would be a card that would say something like, pay 1 blue, draw a card. If you control a Planeswalker named Jace, draw 3 cards instead. You would get a substantial power outlier, but it would be sliced so thinly that it would only really be able to go alongside one other kind of or like inside one archetype. I do think that sort of strict idea has some drawbacks. One is that it's very prescriptive to players. You're basically saying, here are the decks that you will be playing, but if you're playing that format to brew decks and come up with new ideas, I think it can be quite difficult to do it in that environment because the most powerful cards are sort of prescribed to you as to what decks they go into. Another problem here is that if you're not constantly reprinting those sort of archetype enablers, you're going to end up with new players having a really big mountain to climb in order to just play the game. They're going to have to acquire those expensive, like, sort of enabler cards to get their archetype to even work. So you really would need to reprint those staples a lot. Not that that's really a bad thing, because then the price of the cards should be fairly low, but it's something to keep in mind that those things would need to maintain in the format. So let's start talking about a few other ideas that I really haven't seen card games do yet. There's sort of ideas that I've been thinking about when looking at my own game and trying to figure out, like, okay, well, how can I reimagine rotation? One of them is something I'm calling non-linear rotation. And basically what it would mean is we just change the structure in which sets rotate so that old sets get to rotate sort of back into the format so that those old cards can come back for a period of time before they would rotate out. And it would probably look something like almost a second chance kind of format for a set. Let me kind of explain how this would work, right? Is that you would release set 1, set 2, and then set 3. And then you would rotate out set 2 first, which I think would feel pretty good to players, because if the majority of them bought into set 1, they're going to be like, oh, well, I have the cards for set 1, cool. And then after that, you would rotate out set 3, but then set 2 would come back. I'll sort of put on the screen here what the pattern would kind of look like for rotation, but basically it would mean that each set kind of gets to go through the rotation twice before it would finally rotate out. This doesn't exactly fix the problem of rotation, but I do think it gives players an elongated lifespan for the game pieces that they have purchased, and also gives designers a bit of a, it's sort of, if you have a design team that can only produce so many sets, this would give you the ability to get the most out of those game pieces that you've already made within a rotating format still. Some problems I see with the system: it's confusing. I could see players like needing to kind of be onboarded into this process. It would probably take a while for sort of the culture generally to understand how this works so that they could communicate this to other players. And new players joining the game, this would be a hurdle, right? They'd be like, okay, well, I don't quite understand which set's legal when and what's going on there. The other problem here is that it doesn't actually solve the rotation problem. The cards do eventually rotate out in the system, but they do get to hang around longer. But yeah, I think at least this would give players a feeling that their cards are worth more for longer, right? They sort of get to come back, have a second chance before they're finally rotated out of the format. The next idea would be to separate some amount of the game rules from the game pieces themselves. And this probably seems like a strange solution for a card game, because card game players are used to all of the rules of the card being on the card itself. Reading the card explains the card. But if you were able to separate some amount of game mechanics from those pieces, and you could update them in something like a rules codex or some kind of a point total that is associated with the card without it actually being printed on the card, you could then change that information without directly affecting the game piece. And this system basically is inspired by the way Warhammer works. When you buy a miniature for Warhammer, the rules text of that miniature are not printed on the miniature. They're in an army book that you have to buy alongside your army so that you can build an army list that you would then be able to take to a tournament. And I feel like Warhammer's version of this is probably like too far, but I could see a spectrum here where you land somewhere in the middle. Maybe your cards have an icon on them that you get to define what that icon does in different ways based on the sort of army book that goes along with that faction. Or perhaps the art on the cards matters. What type of a weapon is the character in the art holding? Can you define what that weapon does in a book separate from the game piece? And we kind of already see some systems that do this now with things like Canadian Highlander, and I think one of the Yu-Gi-Oh formats does this, where you have points that are associated with cards that are not printed on the cards, and then you get a set number of points that you get to use to build your deck. So for instance, with Canadian Highlander, you get 10 points, and certain cards are worth 1 point, other cards are worth up to 10 points, and that's a way for you to make sure that those two cards can't be played in the deck together, but they can both still be played in the format. And I think this is a pretty good solution. The only real problem here, again, is the upkeep, right? You need a way to show players that this is how the format works, and they need to reference the point totals, and then you need a way to communicate to them when something has changed. With Warhammer, it's pretty clear when something has changed because there's sort of a new edition that comes out and new army books are printed. But I do think this is underexplored in the TCG space generally. But yeah, this one would actually solve rotation, but it does create some other kind of upkeep problems. So the last sort of direction I wanted to explore today is this idea of creating a different kind of system of entropy that is sort of tied to the game systems themselves. The thing that I always thought was kind of weird about rotation is that it's not really built into the game systems. It's kind of a system that's stapled on top of them. But if you could create some kind of resistance within the game systems to playing the most powerful cards, queens, right, you could then somehow use that to kind of put a lot more force against players being able to play the most optimal cards all the time. Because that's really the problem we're trying to solve here. For instance, let's say if one of your creatures was to die during the game, maybe it's dead for the rest of the match. That would mean that different creatures are higher priority targets, and a player might be thinking, if I spend my removal in this moment to destroy this card, maybe it's not the most optimal target right now, but it could be the most optimal target if that will affect subsequent games. So yeah, once the cards would like die in the game itself and you would go to game 2 or 3, you would need to replace those cards with some other cards. Maybe there's like default cards that they get replaced with, like lands, but that's kind of a little weird. Or you have to replace them with cards out of effectively your sideboard or something. But this would kind of just create additional deck slots. It doesn't necessarily handle the rotation part of this. This is kind of similar to the system that Hearthstone used to use in their competitive formats, where you would have to bring, I think it's 3 different decks. And once you won or lost, I can't remember exactly, with one of the decks, you wouldn't be able to play that deck again. I think it's whenever you won. Whenever you would win with a deck, you wouldn't be able to play that deck again. So then you'd have to win with one of the other 2 decks that you brought. And this just is like a really hard force on the meta to say that, like, well, we could have like the best deck in the format, but you're only going to be able to win one of the games with that best deck. Another thing I'll say that is another system that kind of adds this entropy to this idea is something that Flesh and Blood uses, where they will retire heroes. I don't know if they're called heroes. They'll sort of retire character cards if they've won too many times. They kind of like put them in this Hall of Fame, I think is what it's called. And that's a way to sort of like systemically ban cards from the format and let the format sort of tell you which cards are power outliers so that they sort of rotate, but they're rotating just through a ban list. The flip side of this is you can give players an incentive to play suboptimal cards. Both Sorcery and Riftbound do this, where in Riftbound, the heroes that are currently in the format, whoever places the highest finish with those heroes gets a special promo like medal card. And so that gives players a reason to play heroes that might not necessarily be the top of the meta, because instead of attempting to win the entire tournament, you're just attempting to place the highest with that character. And Sorcery does something similar with their avatars, where if you win a tournament with an avatar, you get a special promo version of them, and those are exceedingly rare, but the ones of the characters that have won more tournaments are obviously less rare, therefore sort of less valuable. And if you're able to win a tournament with a avatar that is underplayed, you'll get this maybe one-of-a-kind card that nobody else has gotten because you won with an avatar nobody else has won with. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. I think there's a lot of space still to explore with those types of systems generally that really can upend this idea that you would need set rotation. But yeah, let me know in the comments your thoughts about any of the things I presented today or other ideas that you've seen other game systems implement. If you'd like to continue the conversation and join a community of like-minded game designers, you can join our Discord. The link's in the description for that. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and like the video, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.